we were doing another syndicated show, which is called the Blank Album Countdown. And it was called that because in every market, it was titled after whatever the call letters were. And I got Phil Hendry to host it.
Welcome once again to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and our conversation continues now with Gary Theroux. He's an author, radio disc jockey, and the proprietor of the History of Rock and Roll. And speaking of which, last time we were discussing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and why is it that artists like Madonna and Janet Jackson are in it, but artists like Grand Funk Railroad and Boston are not?
Well, a lot of that had to do with the way the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was formed. Norm N. Knight, who is a prominent DJ in New York, and he also wrote an early rock encyclopedia, called me up to tell me about the establishment of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Gee, Gary, you ought to get involved in this. And I, of course, was really interested. Mm-hmm. But then I found out that it was truly a closed shop. They only wanted in their own friends to be involved. And Jan Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone, had taken over from Ahmet Ertegun, who was another of the founders. Mm-hmm. And unless Jan Wenner liked you, you weren't getting in. Mm. And that's what kept out, say, the Dave Clark Five.
Wow.
Were they not rock and rollers?
They were.
Jan Wenner didn't like them. Mm. And other acts like that. So the ones who actually got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it was a very select group of people who chose them, and they were not interested in input from anybody. I was invited to become a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame organization, but only in terms if I would buy a table at the induction ceremony. So I went to the first 3 or 4 of them, but eventually I gave up because I wanted to be actually involved with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But again, they were a closed shop, and they still are. So that's why some really bizarre people have been inducted, while others who are far more deserving have been shut out for years.
Oh, yeah. I remember there's a book that was written probably about 30 years ago called The 50 Worst Songs, The 50 Worst Artists, and the Worst Albums. And it was a pretty funny book. Actually, 50 Worst Albums, The Worst Artist. And they had this 33 and a half rules. If you break, you'll make a bad record. Rule number 9, actors aren't rock stars. Rule number 10, rock stars aren't actors. Another one said, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is an oxymoron. If you want your work recognized in a museum, learn how to paint. And so it was a pretty funny book. Even if you liked the song and they were saying it was a bad record, it was pretty funny observations about certain tunes. But, I
have some books like that. And, of course, some of the conclusions they draw, they're trying to be amusing, actually, rather than accurate. Because someone can be a singer and an actor. In fact, Gladys Knight told me that she is an actress. She said, think about it. I go in concert and I sing a song about being brokenhearted, and then I turn around and I'm exuberant. And then I turn around and I'm in a completely different mood. Every song is I act to.
Wow. And I
act to music.
That's a great point. I never thought about that. I remember she was on a short-lived sitcom called Charlie and Company with Flip Wilson. He was the star of the show. Along with her, they were husband and wife. And so that was actually kind of how I was introduced to Gladys Knight, was through that sitcom. My dad said, that's singer Gladys Knight. I was like, oh, okay. That was the first time I heard of her.
Yeah, well, Gladys Knight, of course, has a career stretching back to a particular backyard birthday party in the 50s when she and her cousins got together and sang and thought, gee, I wonder if we can do anything with this. And so they would perform at church socials and wherever they could. And eventually, in the very late 50s, they hooked up with a couple of independent labels and recorded a song called Every Beat of My Heart, for which they did not get paid. And that actually became a top 10 single, the first Gladys Knight and the Pips single. And incidentally, the way they got the name Pip was the nickname of one of her cousins.
Mm.
And she told me about they would go on the road, and people thought that, well, they're big stars, they're making buckets of money, when in fact they weren't. And the way that their suits got pressed is Gladys would have the guys lift the mattresses off the beds, and they place their stage attire on top of the inner spring and then put the mattress back. That's how they press their suits.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this about artists not having money. Like a friend of mine was telling me he has a book called Without You, The Tragic Story of Badfinger. And Badfinger was selling tons of records back in the early 70s. And they were asking fans to help them out monetarily, and the fans were like, "Oh, come on, you're rich," and they said, "No, we're not." And then she was with Motown, the Gladys Knight and the Pips, and most of those artists didn't make any money. I think the only ones who really made money on Motown were Smokey Robinson, because he was vice president and wrote most of the tunes, Diana Ross and Stevie Wonder. Otherwise, everybody else who was on Motown didn't make much of anything at all.
Yeah, well, that's actually true. Because what would happen is an act, either a solo singer or a group, would build a following. They'd create some music, and they might spend 5-10 years building up to the point where they were actually had genuine mass appeal, and they get a record contract. And the strongest song in their repertoire would be released as the first single. And let's say it became a top 5 hit. Well, that's great. Well, let's see what else is on the album we can release. Oh, well, here's one. Let's put this out. Oh, it's 15. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll pull another one. Oh, this hits 42. Well, we need another album. Yeah, but we spent 10 years building up this repertoire, and we've been on the road touring. We haven't had any time to write or come up with anything new. Well, we need another album. And this is why most recording artists' careers last 18 months.
Hmm. And with the history of rock and roll, how did it help some artists? Were there any artists in particular that it helped revive their careers years after the careers seemed to be over?
Well, one thing that it did was a lot of the things in the history of rock and roll brought new attention to artists who were out basically playing, dingy little clubs. And it brought new interest because now their music was getting played on the radio again. And that helped. This isn't really necessarily tied to the history of rock and roll, but the former lead singer of the Drifters, Ben E. King, left there because he wanted to record some songs that the management of the Drifters didn't like, and did, and so he got dumped from the group. So he had a solo career for a while, but it faded out. And he was playing really junky places. And suddenly this movie called Stand By Me came out, and in it was his 1961 recording of Stand By Me, which was his rewrite, by the way, of a gospel standard called Stand By Me, Lord. And Benny King discovered that his 25-year-old record was suddenly in the top 10. And now he was a hot property. But he was booked into all these crummy little dives. And by the time he got out of those contracts, the record was off the charts again. So that kind of thing happens too.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years after that, my dad became good friends with Brian Byrne, Mr. Rock and Roll, who was on Oldie Station Keith 101 for 29 years. And Brian put on the Legends of Rock and Roll series, and he still does a lot of rock and roll legends concerts throughout Southern California and the West Coast. And Brian had Benny King at one of the concerts at the Pacific Amphitheater in Costa Mesa, which is in Orange County. And Benny King sang all his Drifters hits, all his solo hits, and even sang Drifters hits he did not sing vocals on, including Under the Boardwalk and On Broadway. But it sounded like the Drifters, so
the audiences didn't know the difference.
No.
They didn't know that he left, actually, I think in 1960.
Wow. I didn't know that either, just till now.
Well, the Drifters, started as basically as backup singers for Clyde McPhatter. And the original Drifters on Atlantic had a string of R&B hits. And then Clyde left, and other people came in and out. Drifters was a good name for the group because people were constantly drifting in and out of it. But by 1959, the Drifters were terrible. And their manager, a guy named George Treadwell, had all these bookings, and the Drifters, were drunk and acted like idiots and stuff. And so he fired the whole group, but he still had these bookings. So he found another group called the Crowns and said, well, now you're the Drifters. And one of the Crowns was Benny King.
Wow.
And they recorded the Drifters songs that you basically know. There Goes My Baby and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And then, you've got other, you've had a lot of other projects as well. After you were at KRLA, you were at Radio Works for about 2 years and did a show called Behind the Hits. Tell us about that program, as well as Remembering the 70s.
Well, Radio Works came right after I left Drake Chenault. There was a woman named Stacy Hunt who had a really good studio inside the RCA building in Hollywood. And I had known her from KISS. And she said, why don't you come over here and maybe we can do some things like you were doing at Drake Chenault, except we would actually own them, because I didn't own the 1978 History of Rock and Roll. So I said, okay. So the first project we put together was another 10-hour special called Remembering the 70s. And, again, I built it around a lot of the artist interviews that I'd conducted and collected over the years. And it went over pretty big. So I then said, let's do a short-form feature called Behind the Hits. So I recorded a whole bunch of those. And unfortunately, what happened was money started coming in to Radio Works. And I didn't realize it when I started with them, but Radio Works was actually a project owned by Stacy's parents, who were very wealthy. And when money started coming in, they started going, oh, finally, this little company we set up for her called Radio Works. Well, actually, it wasn't called that. It was called something else, and I gave it the name Radio Works. Gee, now money is coming in. What do we need this guy for? So they cut me out of the company. And we were doing another syndicated show, which is called the Blank Album Countdown. And it was called that because in every market, it was titled after whatever the call letters were, the WXXX album countdown, whatever. And I got Phil Hendry to host it.
Wow.
And Phil at that time was very little known, but I thought he was really a great talent. And so we started the Blank Album Countdown, and it ran for about 6 or 7 months before they figured, what do we need this guy for? And so they got some interns to write the next episode. And, of course, it was a complete disaster. And almost all of our affiliates canceled the next week, quite angrily. And the rest canceled the next week. And Radio Works quickly faded.
And then after that, you went to Reader's Digest, where you were for the next 20 years, and got to...
Yeah, what happened with Reader's Digest was I got a call that Reader's Digest, of course, had been releasing albums since 1959, box sets. And in fact, in the early 60s, they sent a flyer to my parents' house promoting an album called The Great Band Era. And it was all this big band stuff. And I didn't really know anything about the big bands. And I showed the brochure to my mom, and I said, who's this Glenn Miller? Who's this Tommy Dorsey? And she said, oh, this is really wonderful music. And I said, well, why don't you order this? And she said, well, we never order that kind of thing. Well, I'm really curious. So she ordered it, and that was my introduction to big band music. And I had no idea that years later I would get a call from Reader's Digest saying that they wanted to have somebody younger there to create albums for younger demographics. And so I flew from L.A. to New York and met with them, and it seemed to go really well. And I didn't hear anything for a while, and then they called up and they said, well, would you be interested in being a consultant? And I said, well, okay. Well, actually, would you be the person over the consultants? And I said, does that mean I have to move? And they said, well, yes. So my whole archive and me and my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, we all moved to the New York area, and I started working for them, putting together box sets of albums, all different types. And it was a great way to explore genres and eras of music that I'd never had a chance to really touch before. And I remember my third album for them, one of the things I'd done at each radio station I worked for was I'd put together the Christmas programming. Because usually a radio station would have a cardboard box with 6 or 7 LPs and a few singles in it, and that was their Christmas programming. And I said, let's put together a Christmas box set of the ultimate, the very best Christmas records ever made. And they go, oh, yeah, right. So I put this thing together, and my boss at the time saw the repertoire for it, and she said, well, we can't put this out. Why? Because nobody buys Christmas music. And I said, well, they'll buy this. So with enormous reluctance, she agreed to let it get released. Mm-hmm. And Christmas Through the Years sold 7,000 units the first week, and eventually sold 11 million sets.
Wow.
Again, making it one of the largest selling music box sets ever released by any label. And I wanted to put in all of the biggest hit versions of every Christmas song you'd think of, like Bing Crosby's White Christmas and Gene Autry's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But she was so convinced that the box set wouldn't sell, she wouldn't let me meet the guarantees that some labels demanded before they'd license a track to you. So I had to make some substitutions. But despite that, the box set became the biggest seller that Reader's Digest music ever had. And so I continued after that, putting together everything from classical to country to R&B and jazz and big bands, and, of course, tons of rock and roll albums.
We're talking with Gary Theroux, and he's talking about different compilations he put out. And next time, he'll discuss the one that he's most proud of.